The fall lasted 3 seconds. Cassia knew because she counted them. Not from calm, not from composure, but because her mind seized on the count the way a drowning person seizes on anything solid. 1. The ground vanished beneath her feet, and the cold air rushed up to meet her. 2. She heard Darian's voice from above, already distant, already retreating into a place she could no longer reach. 3. Then the stone floor of the den came up and hit her like a punishment from the gods themselves. She landed hard on her shoulder and rolled. The impact cracked through her bones, the breath leaving her body in one sharp expulsion. For a moment, she could only lie there on her back in the absolute dark, staring at nothing, chest heaving, mind still 3 seconds behind her body. The opening above her was a narrow rectangle of torchlight, growing smaller as her eyes adjusted. The silhouette of a man stood at its edge. Darian, she said his name before she understood what she was seeing. Darian, give me your hand. He stepped back from the edge. The torchlight shrank as something heavy was dragged across the opening above. Stone grinding against stone. Then darkness. Total, complete, without mercy. Cassia pressed her palms flat to the ground and pushed herself upright. Her shoulder screamed. She ignored it. Her wolf blood was already working, the pain dulling at the edges, the bruised tissue beginning its slow crawl toward repair. But she barely noticed that either, because something in the dark had noticed her. She felt it before she heard it. A pressure change, a shift in the weight of the air, the way the atmosphere in a room changes when something enormous begins to move. Then the smell hit her. Animal and iron and something ancient underneath. A musk so thick it coated the back of her throat. And then the sound. Starting low below the range of normal hearing, felt in the teeth and the sternum before it became a growl. Rising and rising until it filled the den, like water fills a sealed room, pressing against every wall, against her skin, against the inside of her skull. She ran. Pure instinct. No thought. Her body made the decision before her mind had finished processing what her senses were screaming at her. She ran blind into the dark with her hands out in front of her and the growl shaking the air at her back. Her boots hit uneven ground and she stumbled. Caught herself. Kept moving. Then something massive clipped her from behind. Not a full hit. If it had been a full hit, she would have been dead. It was the edge of a paw, a glancing blow, but it was enough to send her spinning sideways into the wall. Her cheek connected with stone. She tasted blood. She pushed off the wall, immediately changed direction, and this time she saw it. The beast had stepped into a shaft of pale light that fell from somewhere far above. A crack in the den's ceiling too small for escape, but wide enough to bleed moonlight onto the floor. What it illuminated made her steps falter for just one heartbeat. It was enormous. Bigger than anything she had ever seen in her years as a wolf. Bigger than the oldest alphas in their shifted forms. Bigger than the stories the elders told to frighten young pups into obedience. It moved on 4 limbs built for killing. Haunches like boulders. Shoulders that rolled with a terrible fluid grace. Its coat was the absolute black of a sky without stars. Its head swung toward her and its eyes caught the moonlight. Silver, pale silver gray and burning. And she ran. But in that single faltering heartbeat, something had pressed itself into her awareness against her will. The way a splinter presses into a thumb, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. Something about those eyes. Not the hunger in them, though the hunger was real and vast and looking directly at her. Something beneath the hunger. Something that did not belong on the face of a mindless beast. She did not have time to think about it. The beast came off its haunches and hit the ground running. She heard it behind her, the rhythm of its movement different from a wolf. Heavier and faster at once. The ground shuddering beneath each stride. She cut left without warning, pressing herself into a narrow channel between 2 jutting outcroppings of rock, too tight for its bulk. She heard it pull up short, heard the frustrated crash of its body against stone, and she kept moving deeper into the channel, hands tracing the wall until the channel opened into a wider space and she had 3 precious seconds to breathe. Her shoulder still ached. Her cheek was wet. She pressed her back against the wall and listened. The growling had stopped. That was worse somehow than the growling. She controlled her breathing, in through the nose, slow, deliberate. Let her wolf senses do what they were built for. She could hear it pacing. The heavy, deliberate footfalls circling the outer edge of the space she had found. Unhurried now, systematic. It was not frantic, it was not confused, it was patient. The understanding settled into her stomach like cold water. It knew this den, every passage, every channel, every dead end. It had all the time in the world, and she had none. Sooner or later she would have to move. and when she moved, it would be ready. She pressed 2 fingers to the bite mark on her neck, still tender. Only last night, Darian's teeth at the base of her throat, the flare of pain followed by warmth, the bond mark settling into her skin the way it was meant to. She had not thought twice about it. She was a wolf. Mating bites were as natural as breathing. Every bonded pair wore one. She had touched it this morning with a kind of quiet wonder, this proof of belonging, of the prophecy finally made real in flesh. Your daughter shall be mated to a king, and her blood shall change the course of a kingdom. She closed her eyes, opened them. Her mother had wept when the seer delivered those words. Her father had read them as elevation, as destiny, as the gods finally remembering that the Winter family existed. And Cassia had believed it through every month of courtship. Believed it when Darian arrived at her father's gate unannounced and smiled at her like she was a problem he was delighted to have found. She had believed it last night when his teeth found her neck. She had been so certain of what the mark meant. She was less certain now. Crouching in the dark beneath a castle she had lived in for 3 weeks, listening to the beast that was hunting her, and understanding with a clarity that felt like grief that Darian had not marked her for love. He had marked her so she would be the right kind of food. The pacing stopped. Silence. And then without warning, the beast came through the darkness. Fast and low, and she had less than a second. She threw herself upward instead of sideways, fingers finding the rough outcroppings of the wall by pure wolf instinct, hauling herself up as the beast's jaws snapped shut on empty air below her feet. The wind of it hit her ankles. She climbed, arms burning, shoulders screaming again, until her hands found a ledge, narrow, barely the width of her body, and she pulled herself onto it and pressed flat against the wall and did not breathe. Below her, the beast hit the wall. The whole den shook, dust rained from the ceiling. It reared back and hit the wall again, claws raking the stone, and she felt every impact through the rock at her back. It could not reach her. The ledge was too high, the wall too sheer beneath it, but the sound it made was not frustration. It was anguish. She did not know how she knew the difference. She simply did. The way you know the difference between rain and a storm before the first drop falls. The sound coming out of the beast below was not the rage of a predator denied its prey. It was something raw and older than rage. It rose through the den and pressed against the sealed ceiling and found no way out and came back down. And Cassia felt it settle in her chest like a stone. She lay on her ledge and looked down through the dark and found the beast already looking up at her. Even from this height, even in this near darkness, those pale eyes were unmistakable. Storm-colored and ancient and burning with something that had no business being in the eyes of a monster. The moonlight from above caught the beast's spine, and she saw it then, something she could only see from this angle, from above. Along the ridge of its back, pressed into the black fur and the flesh beneath like a seal pressed into wax, was a marking, silver-white against black, old enough to have scarred over. She knew that shape. Every wolf in the kingdom knew that shape. The royal crest of Athoria, the crowned wolf, the mark of the bloodline that had ruled this kingdom for 200 years. Cassia stopped breathing. Below her, the beast lay down on the cold stone floor of the den. Not in preparation to spring, not circling. It lay down the way something lies down when it has been carrying a weight for so long that the body simply stops. Its enormous head came to rest on its forepaws. Its silver eyes stayed open, watching her, waiting for something she could not name. The silence between them was different now. She did not understand it yet. She had too many pieces and not enough of the picture. But the pieces were there. The royal crest burned into the beast's spine, the mating bite on her neck, the bones along the wall she could see now in the dim light, still wearing silk, the way Darian had smiled and stepped back from the edge. The way this creature, which should have torn her apart 3 times already, had pulled back each time with something in its gaze that looked like restraint, like it was fighting itself, like part of it did not want to. She pressed her fingers to the bite on her neck and looked down at the marked beast below her. And the thought that formed was not the thought of a woman who had just survived her wedding night in a monster's den. It was the thought of a woman who had just begun to understand the shape of the trap. Not just hers, his too. She would not sleep tonight, she knew that. But she pulled her knees to her chest and kept her eyes on the beast below. And she began very quietly to think. 6 weeks earlier, the morning had smelled of river fog and her mother's bread. Cassia stood at the window of her family's house in the merchant quarter of Aldemir and watched the Karna River disappear beneath its morning mist. And she thought about the prophecy as she always did, the way a tongue finds a loose tooth, not because it wants to, but because it cannot seem to stop. Your daughter shall be mated to a king, and her blood shall change the course of a kingdom. The seer who had spoken those words was 3 days dead by the time they reached her parents. Seers of that kind, the old ones, the ones whose visions arrived not as whispers, but as certainties that cost something to carry, did not live long after the great ones came, as though the vision used them up. Her father had taken it as proof of its importance. Her mother had wept for a week and then begun quietly and methodically, making sure Cassia knew how to walk into a room full of nobles without embarrassing anyone. Cassia had spent the next 17 years being prepared for a destiny she had never asked for, and trying to feel grateful about it. She was not highborn. That was the first inconvenient fact. Her father Tobias was a spice merchant, successful, respected within his world, possessed of enough coin to have 4 glass windows and educated daughters, but not enough to be anything but a curiosity in the circles where kings moved. Her mother Rhiannon had a grandmother with noble blood, which everyone in the family mentioned, and no one outside the family cared about. But wolves were wolves. Status mattered. The bond mattered more. And if the gods had decided that Cassia Winter of the merchant house of Aldemir was going to be mated to a king, then the gods would find a way to make it happen. She simply had not expected the way to involve the king showing up at the front gate. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard her father's voice crack into a register it had never produced before, something between reverence and panic. And she opened the front door herself, which she knew would horrify the housekeeper. And she found King Darian of Ethoria standing in their courtyard. He looked at her, standing barefoot on her own doorstep with a book still in her hand, and he smiled, warm and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and had decided to spend some of it being charmed by her. "I despise ceremony," he said by way of greeting. "You must be Cassia." Behind her, she heard her mother make a sound that was mostly tears. She did not curtsy. The instinct was there. 17 years of preparation had installed it thoroughly. But something about the amusement in his eyes made her not want to give him the satisfaction. "You must be the king," she said. He laughed. She believed it was real. She would believe a great many things about him over the 2 months that followed. The courtship was beautiful the way a well-made trap is beautiful, in its craftsmanship, in the care of its construction, in the way it fits so precisely around the shape of her. He remembered everything she said, not in the way of a man performing attentiveness, but in the way of someone cataloging information. She would say something once in passing, and it would appear weeks later, quietly embedded in something he did. She had mentioned wildflowers. Every arrangement after that smelled of meadow. She had mentioned that she found formal feasts exhausting. The performance of them. He began inviting her to smaller dinners, just the two of them, where she could speak without calculating every word first. She fell in love with him the way she had always been warned not to, completely and without much dignity, and faster than was sensible for a merchant's daughter being courted by a king. His previous wives she did not ask about directly. It seemed unkind. He had been married twice before. Both had died. One in childbirth early in his 4th year as king. One of fever just months ago, leaving barely enough time for the kingdom to finish mourning before he arrived at Cassia's gate. He spoke of them with a grief that seemed genuine, his eyes going soft and distant. She had felt guilty for even the small probe she had made. No one warned her. Not one person in Aldemir, in the capital, in the long weeks she spent at court before the wedding, stood up and said the things she needed to hear. The king's wives do not die. The king's wives disappear. She did not know this. She knew only the prophecy and the wildflowers and the way he looked at her sometimes as though she had surprised him. She knew the warmth of the mating bite when it came. His teeth at her neck. Pain sharpening into heat, sharpening into the deep settling sensation of the bond mark. Familiar and right. The most natural thing in the world for two wolves to share. And she had touched the mark that morning with something close to reverence. She had been so certain of what it meant. She was still certain of it when he came to her chambers that night, with a smile and a torch and an offer of a surprise. A secret garden in the old wing. Roses untouched for decades. He thought she would love it. And she had gone with him willingly, through the castle's back passages, her hand in his, her heart entirely open. She had not been afraid until the floor disappeared. He had said, "Close your eyes." And she had, because she trusted him, because she loved him, because she was the kind of fool who believed in prophecies. She felt the ground change beneath her, carpet to stone to something rougher, and the air changed too, colder and damper than any garden. But she kept her eyes closed and kept walking. Then his hand released hers. Then his palm found the center of her back. The push was not hard. It did not need to be. She was already at the edge. One firm shove and the ground was simply gone. And she fell. 3 seconds into the dark. While above her, the man she loved stepped back from the edge. And his expression, the last thing she saw before the darkness took her, was not grief. It was relief. She must have stayed on the ledge for 3 hours, maybe 4. The den had its own clock. The slow movement of the moonlight through the ceiling crack, the way the cold deepened as the night went on, and the rhythm of the beast breathing below her, which had gradually slowed from the sharp cadence of a hunting animal to something steadier. More exhausted than calm, she had used the time to look, to catalog, to think. The den was large, larger than any natural cave. It had been carved out, or built. She was not sure which. Its walls cut in long, deliberate lines that spoke of human hands even under the centuries of grime. There were marks on the walls. She could not read them from the ledge, but she could see their shapes. Regular, repeated, not the random scratchings of an animal, but something intentional. Something someone had needed to say. The bones were in the far corner. She had seen them when the moonlight shifted. There were more than she had first thought. Some old, some less so. In fabric, silk and linen. And once unmistakably the embroidered hem of a wedding gown. Her stomach had done something complicated at that. 2 women in the space of months, she calculated, tracing the timeline of what she knew. Darian had been king for 4 years. His first wife had died early in year 3. His second just months ago in year 4. And now her. The kingdom believed in fever and childbirth. The kingdom had been given believable stories and had chosen to believe them, because it was easier than asking questions about a king. She looked at the beast. It had not moved from the floor in over an hour. Those pale eyes were open, watching her with that terrible silver patience. And she found herself noticing again what she had no sensible explanation for noticing. The quality of the exhaustion but on it, not the dull absence of a beast at rest, something heavy and ongoing, like a man who has been carrying a grief so long, he has forgotten what his body feels like without it. It had tried to kill her 3 times. She had the evidence on her hands and her shoulder and her cheek. It also had a royal crest burned into its spine like a brand put there by someone else's hand. "I don't know what was done to you," she said quietly, testing her own voice in the silence. But it wasn't nothing. The beast's ear moved, swiveling toward her the way a wolf's ear moves toward a sound it is trying to understand. It did not growl. Cassia filed that away. She looked up at the sealed ceiling, at the crack of moonlight in the stone that had been dragged across the only opening, and she felt the full shape of where she was settle into her body like a stone dropping into still water. Sealed in, no door, no latch to pick, no handle to force. Just solid rock and the beast below and the bones in the corner and the mark on her neck that was supposed to be love. She thought of her mother, of the prophecy on her father's wall, of Darian's warm brown eyes and the relief on his face as she fell. She pressed her back against the wall and looked down at the beast and made a decision. She was not going to die here. And with a certainty she could not entirely explain and did not fully understand yet, she did not think he was going to let her. The second day began with water. She found it herself, a thin seep along the eastern wall collecting in a shallow basin of rock. She drank, refilled what she could carry cupped in her hands, and began moving along the walls. She was looking for a way out. She ran her palms along every surface, feeling for variation, temperature changes or air movement, the hollow resonance that might mean something on the other side. The beast watched her from its position at the far end of the den, not following, not interfering, enduring her presence the way something endures weather. By the 3rd day she had covered most of the accessible perimeter. Her hands were raw, her shoulder had healed enough that she could lift her arm without gasping. And she had found nothing. Nothing but the inscriptions. They ran along the base of the northern wall in continuous lines, carved in the formal script of the kingdom's early centuries. Old lettering, deep cuts made by something that had needed claws to do it, and patience to do it carefully. She crouched and read, names first, dates, and beside each a few lines. Not records exactly, more like the kind of words written when words are the only thing left to offer. Adriana of House Crane, full moon of the harvest month. She sang to herself in the dark, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. She did not deserve this end. Cassia pressed her fingers to the letters, looked at the length of the wall, counted, 2 names. Only 2, both recent, both within the last year and a half. She had expected more, and the relief of finding only 2 complicated itself immediately when she realized who those 2 women were. The first wife of King Darien, said to have died in childbirth. The second, said to have died of fever. She stood up slowly, turned and looked at the beast across the den. It had not moved, still facing the wall, still carrying its defeat like a physical weight. Two, she said, in less than 2 years. Before that, nothing. The beast's ear moved. This started when Darien became king. She was piecing it together out loud, the way she had always thought, by speaking the shape of things until they revealed themselves. Which means you weren't always this, she crossed the den slowly, until she was closer than she had come voluntarily before. Who were you? The beast turned its head, and then it did something she was not prepared for. It rose and moved. Not toward her, but to the section of wall to the left of the inscriptions, where the stone was newer and the carving more recent. It placed one claw against the wall, and with a deliberateness that stopped her breath, it scratched a single word into the stone. She stepped closer and read it. Theron. The air went out of her. She knew that name. Every wolf in the kingdom knew that name. Alpha King Theron, the firstborn son of the old king, rightful heir to the throne of Athoria. Dead these 4 years, they said. Dead before he could be crowned. No body, no grave, only the stepmother's grief and Darien's coronation following within the same month. She looked at the beast, at the royal crest burned into its spine, visible now as it stood broadside to her in the dim light, at those storm-colored eyes watching her with that ancient, exhausted attention. She didn't kill you, Cassia said. Her voice was steady, flat. The way voices become when the mind is working too fast for emotion to catch up. She made you worse than dead. She understood it fully now. The old king weakening from sickness. A stepmother with knowledge of old magic. A stepson who stood between her son and a throne. A curse that turned the heir into a monster that needed feeding. And a feeding that required royal blood. Which meant marriage. Which meant Darien needed a reason to keep marrying. And his wives needed a reason to keep disappearing. A perfect sealed system of cruelty. Built to last indefinitely. She thought of her parents, of the prophecy on the wall, of how easy it was to build a trap around a person if you understood what they believed in. The anger arrived, quiet and deep and entirely resolved. I'm going to find a way out of this wall, she said, and she held his gaze. Those silver eyes that had watched 2 women die and carved their names so they would not be forgotten. And then I'm going to burn what they built to the ground. She took one step closer. Both of ours, I mean that. The beast looked at her. Something moved in those pale eyes, too complex to name, too deliberate to dismiss. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds before looking away. She took it for what it was. A beginning. The days that followed became the beginning of something she had not planned for. She talked while she worked the walls. That was how it started, filling the silence because silence made the den feel smaller. Narrating her thinking out loud because that was how she thought best. But gradually, almost without her noticing it, became less narration and more conversation. She would say something and pause. And Theron would respond, not with words, but with the precise, legible language his body had developed over years of needing to communicate without one. The ear swivel for attention, the slow blink for understanding. The particular angle of the head that meant she had said something that landed somewhere real. She learned his vocabulary, and he learned hers. And the distance between them closed. Not dramatically, but by degrees, by the slow daily accumulation of proximity, of her voice and his attention and the growing ease of being known. On the 5th day, she caught a fish from the underground stream that fed the water basin. She did not know she could. But hunger made experimenters of everyone, and her wolf instincts, it turned out, extended to fishing when properly motivated. She built a small fire from kindling she scraped together, cooked the fish over it, ate half, and left the other half on a flat rock near where Theron usually settled. She did not say anything about it, did not make a production of the offering, simply left it and returned to her work on the western wall. When she looked back an hour later, the fish was gone. And Theron was looking at her with an expression she could not read, but it felt like gratitude, or something close enough that the difference did not matter. On the 7th day, she woke from a dream of falling, gasping, her heart a drum against her ribs, and found that Theron had moved closer overnight. Not touching, but near enough that the warmth of his body had reached her through the cold, near enough that his presence had become a kind of shelter. She did not say anything about that either, but she felt steadier for the rest of the day. On the 9th day, she sat with her back against the northern wall reading the inscriptions again, and he came and lay down 6 feet away. Neither of them made anything of it. By the 11th day, she was working a section of wall near the western corner, a spot she had identified from the resonance beneath her palms, the hollow sound that meant something on the other side. She felt him settle behind her, close enough that the warmth of his body reached her through the cold. She did not stop working, but she felt steadier. She thought about that later, how steady she felt with a beast at her back. On the 12th day, she was explaining the merchant politics of Aldemir, the way the river trade worked, the families who controlled which docks, and she watched his reactions to the names she mentioned. His ear would twitch at certain ones. Those pale eyes would narrow at others, and she realized he knew them, had known them, when he was the crown prince and such things mattered to the governance of a kingdom. "You miss it," she said, not a question. He looked at her for a long moment, then away. But she had seen the answer in his gaze, and it broke something in her chest that she did not have the vocabulary for and did not try to name. On the 13th day, everything changed. She was working the eastern corner, an area she had passed over before because it seemed solid. But something made her go back. Some instinct, some whisper of wrongness. She found the scratches in the stone, hidden in a crevice, deliberately concealed. Not one word, many words, many names. She pulled them into the light and read, seer names, 8 of them, with dates beside each, and a single word that repeated, delivered. Her hands started shaking before her mind caught up. 8 seers, 8 prophecies, all delivered within the last 6 years, all to families across the kingdom, minor nobles, wealthy merchants, people with daughters the right age, and beside each seer's name a death date, 3 days after delivery, 5 days, a week at most, every single one. She stood up slowly, her heart doing something violent in her chest. "They were planted," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "The prophecies, all of them. Morgantha planted them." She turned and looked at Theron. He had risen to his feet, watching her. "She sent seers to families across the kingdom, gave them prophecies about daughters being mated to kings, and then killed the seers so no one could trace it back. The pieces were falling into place now, fast and sharp and cutting on the way down. She created a pool of candidates, girls whose families would believe they were destined for royalty, who would be easy to court, easy to convince, easy to deliver." Her mother's tears, her father's framed prophecy on the wall. 17 years of preparation for a destiny that had never been real. It had all been a recruitment tool. "My whole life," she said, and her voice broke on it. "My whole life was her design." She pressed her palms to her eyes, breathed, forced herself to think past the grief, because grief could wait. Grief was a luxury for after survival. She looked at Theron. "How many," she asked, "how many prophecies did she plant?" He moved to the wall, scratched with one claw, carefully. 8 lines, then a pause. Then 6 more. 14. 14 families told their daughters were destined to be queens. 14 girls raised to believe in a prophecy that was nothing more than bait. "And we were the ones who survived long enough to be chosen," Cassia said. Theron's gaze met hers, and in them she saw confirmation. And something else. Apology, as though any of this was his fault. She crossed the den, placed her palm flat against the wall beside his claw marks. "This is not on you," she said. Her voice was steel now, tempered and sharp. "None of this has ever been on you. Do you understand me?" He looked at her, those silver eyes searching her face for something. She held his gaze. "Morgantha cursed you. Darian used you. And I was delivered to you like a meal designed by someone who understands exactly how to make a trap feel like destiny." She pressed her hand harder against the stone. "But I am not going to die for their convenience. And neither are you." The rage had arrived fully now, quiet and deep and absolutely resolved. "I'm going to find a way out of this wall," she said, "and then I'm going to burn what they built to the ground. The prophecies, the curse, the throne Darian is sitting on with his mother's magic propping him up." She looked at Theron, at this man who had been robbed of his voice and his throne and 4 years of his life, who had been forced to kill 2 women and carve their names into stone so they would not be forgotten, who had been made into a weapon and then punished for the wounds he was forced to inflict. "Both of ours," she said again. "I mean that." His eyes held hers, and something moved through them that she had not seen before. Not hope, not yet, but the place that hope comes from, cracked open for the first time in 4 years, letting in air. She stepped back, looked at the western wall, the hollow section she had been working for days. "Tomorrow we start breaking through," she said. Together, Theron looked at the wall, then at her. And for the first time since she had fallen into this den, the Alpha King, the rightful ruler of Athoria, moved not from hunger or instinct or the pull of a curse. He moved because he had chosen to. He came to stand beside her, facing the wall that had held him for 4 years. And Cassia, standing beside a beast who was not a beast at all, felt something settle in her chest. Not safety, not yet, but something close enough to call it by name. Alliance. And in the dark of the den, with the bones of the women who came before and the prophecy that had never been real and the throne that waited above, she smiled. Let them think she was dead. Let them think the system held. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Day 14 began the way all the days before it had begun, with cold stone beneath her back and the slow shift of moonlight across the den ceiling. But something had changed in Cassia during the night between day 13 and day 14. Something that had solidified when she understood the full shape of the trap Morgantha had built around her life. She was done being a piece in someone else's game. She rose from the ledge where she had spent the night and looked down at Theron. He was already awake, watching her with the kind of attention that had become familiar over these 2 weeks. Not the attention of a predator watching prey. The attention of someone who had been alone for 4 years and was learning again what it meant to be seen. We're breaking that wall today, she said. Her voice carried across the den with a certainty she had not possessed 13 days ago. I don't care how thick it is. I don't care how long it takes. We're getting out of here. Theron rose to his feet. The movement was fluid, despite his size, all that terrible grace contained in a body built for destruction, but holding something gentler underneath. He moved to the western wall, to the section she had identified days ago by the hollow resonance beneath her palms. He looked at her, one slow blink. Yes. She climbed down from the ledge and crossed to stand beside him. Her shoulder still ached from the fall that had started all of this, but her wolf blood had done its work. The bruises had faded, the scrapes had closed. She was healing in all the ways that could be measured in flesh and bone. The other wounds would take longer. Here, she said, pressing her palm flat against the stone. Do you feel it, the way the sound changes when I tap? Theron lowered his massive head and pressed his ear against the wall where her hand had been. His ears swiveled, catching the subtle difference in tone. He looked at her again and blinked once. Then let's find out what's on the other side. What followed was work. Pure, methodical work. Cassia directed, and Theron struck his claws, finding purchase in the tiny fissures she identified, widening them fraction by fraction. She would point, he would strike. She would check the damage, find the next weak point, and point again. They did not speak. They did not need to. The language they had built over 13 days worked perfectly for this. Days 14 and 15 passed in a rhythm of strike and check and strike again. The sound of stone scraping against stone became the soundtrack of their days. On day 16, a crack appeared, running from floor to ceiling like a seam in fabric waiting to be torn. Cassia traced it with her fingers and felt her heart kick hard against her ribs. Again, she said, right here, put everything into it. Theron reared back and struck. The impact shook the entire den. Dust rained from the ceiling. The crack widened. And on the fifth strike, a chunk of stone the size of Cassia's head broke free and crashed to the floor. Cold air rushed through the opening, not the stale air of the den, but fresh air that had recently known the sky. Air that tasted of freedom. Cassia laughed. The sound surprised her, bursting out before she could stop it, pure and bright. Theron's head swung toward her in what might have been shock. She laughed again, this time on purpose, and pressed her hand against the opening. There's something on the other side, she said. We just have to make it big enough to get through. It was on day 17, while they rested between strikes, that Cassia asked the question she had been holding since the night she learned his name. What was it like before? Theron had been lying on his side, watching the slow movement of light across the ceiling. At her question, his ears swiveled toward her, but he did not turn his head. Before the curse, she clarified, when you were still yourself. What was your life like? For a long moment he did not respond. Then slowly he turned to look at her. His silver gray eyes held something complicated, something that looked like pain and longing, and a grief so old it had settled into the marrow of his bones. And then, for the first time since she had fallen into this den, Cassia saw something shift behind those eyes. Not just understanding or communication. Memory. The images came to her in flashes, not words but feelings, in fragments that pressed against her mind, the way his presence pressed against the air. She did not know how it was happening, only that it was. Some remnant of the royal magic that had been twisted into the curse, perhaps. some connection forged by 2 weeks of proximity and shared survival. She saw a young man tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and those same pale eyes. She saw him in a training yard sword in hand, moving with a grace that came from years of practice. She saw an older man watching from the sidelines, pride written across every line of his weathered face. Father and son, king and heir. She saw the same young man years older sitting in a council chamber, listening to advisors argue about trade routes and border disputes. She saw him making decisions with careful thought, asking questions that cut through political maneuvering to the heart of what mattered. She saw him walking through the capital city without guard or ceremony, stopping to speak with merchants and craftsmen, learning his kingdom from the ground up. She saw love, not romantic love, but the kind of love that comes from duty fulfilled and people cherished. The love of a man who understood that a crown was not a prize but a responsibility. And then the images darkened. She saw the old king in his bed, illness ravaging his body week by week. She saw advisors falling mysteriously ill one after another until only a few remained. She saw a woman in gray, small and composed, always at the old king's bedside, always helpful. Morgantha. She saw the young man Theron, trusting. She saw him follow Morgantha to a chamber deep in the castle, saw her explain that his father wanted to pass on a secret ritual, a strengthening of the royal bloodline that would help him rule. She saw him believe her because why wouldn't he? She had been his father's wife for 10 years. She had raised Darian from childhood. She was family. She saw the ritual chamber, the binding circles, the arcane symbols carved into stone. She saw Morgantha's face change when the door closed behind him, saw kindness slide away to reveal something cold and calculated underneath. She saw him realize too late what was happening. She saw the curse take hold, saw his body twist and change, saw bone reshape and fur sprout and mind fracture under the weight of something dark and hungry being forced into the space where his humanity used to live. Saw him try to fight it, try to hold on to himself and fail. Saw him become the thing in the den. The last image was the worst. It was Theron, beast-formed and newly cursed, waking in the den for the first time. Confused, terrified. Still enough himself to understand what had been done to him, but not enough to stop the hunger that came with the full moon. And standing at the edge of the opening, above looking down, was Morgantha. She was speaking, but Cassia could not hear the words. She could only see Theron's eyes, silver gray and desperate, looking up at the woman who had destroyed him. Then the stone sealed over, and he was alone in the dark. The visions faded. Cassia found herself on her knees on the den floor without remembering how she had gotten there. Her face was wet. She was crying, she realized distantly. Crying for the young man in the training yard who had been good and decent and trusting. Crying for the 4 years that had been stolen from him. Crying for the women he had been forced to hurt. Theron had not moved. He was watching her with those ancient, exhausted eyes, and she understood suddenly that he had shown her these things on purpose, that he needed her to see them, needed someone, anyone to know who he had been before the curse made him unrecognizable, even to himself. "I see you," she said. Her voice was rough from crying from 2 weeks of cold air and stone dust. "I see who you were. I see who you still are underneath all of this. And I swear to you, Theron, I am going to help you get it back." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his massive head until his forehead rested against her shoulder. The gesture was so human, so full of a grief that had been carried alone for too long that Cassia's breath caught in her throat. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Day 18 brought steady progress. The crack widened. The opening grew. By evening, it was large enough that Cassia could stick her whole arm through and feel the passage beyond. 2 more days, she said. Maybe 3, then we can get through. On day 19, Cassia woke before the light shifted and found Theron already awake, staring at the western wall. There was something different in his posture, something resolved. She climbed down from her ledge and joined him. They stood side by side in the pre-dawn dimness, looking at the crack they had spent days widening. "My father used to tell me something," Cassia said. "He would say that destiny was written in the stars and our job was just to find our place in it." I believed him. I believed it so completely that I spent 17 years preparing to be someone's queen without ever asking if that was what I wanted. She paused. "But here's what I've learned. Destiny isn't written in the stars. It's written by people with power who want to control the people without it. Morgantha wrote my destiny when she planted that prophecy. She wrote yours when she cursed you." She turned to look at him. "But destiny is just someone else's plan until you take it back, until you decide that your story belongs to you. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to break through that wall and we're going to walk out of here and we're going to burn down every word of the destiny Morgantha wrote for us. Theron's silver-gray eyes held hers. In them, she saw understanding. More than understanding, she saw choice. The decision to stop being the thing that had been done to him and start being the person who would undo it. He turned to the wall, and he struck. Day 20 arrived with the pressure change Cassia felt in her bones before she understood what it meant. Theron felt it too. She could see it in the restlessness that had returned to his movements, in the particular tension that had entered his body overnight. The full moon was coming. How long, she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. He stopped pacing long enough to meet her eyes. His pupils were already starting to dilate, the silver gray beginning to cloud with something else. Something hungry. Tonight. I'm not going to leave, she said. I'm not going to hide from you. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. Theron's eyes held hers. 2 blinks, no. I'm not asking for permission, she said firmly. You are Theron Ashvale, firstborn heir of the kingdom of Athoria, rightful king, and you are not the hunger. The hunger is something that was done to you. It does not control you unless you let it, and I believe you are stronger than it is. She crossed to him and placed her palm against his jaw one more time. Stay with me, she said. When the moon rises and the hunger comes, stay with me. I'll be right here. He held her gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then he turned and walked to the far end of the den and settled there facing the wall, putting his back to her. The waiting was the worst part. Cassia sat against the northern wall and watched the light from the ceiling cracks shift and fade as the sun set somewhere far above. She watched Theron's breathing change, watched the tremor that started in his shoulders and spread through his entire body. When the moonlight finally spilled through the crack in the ceiling, silver and cold and merciless, she heard him make a sound that was both growl and groan, hunger and resistance fighting for control. Then she heard something else, stone grinding against stone, the familiar sound of the opening being unsealed. Cassia's head snapped up. Moonlight was flooding through the opening above, and silhouetted against that moonlight was a figure falling. The figure hit the den floor hard 20 feet from where Cassia sat. She heard the impact, heard the breath forced out of young lungs, heard the scrambling of hands against stone. And she heard Theron move. The hunger took him instantly, completely, in a way it had not taken him before, because tonight it had been nearly a month since the last feeding. Tonight the moon was full. Tonight the curse was at its strongest. And tonight there was fresh royal blood in the den. Cassia was on her feet and moving before the thought fully formed. She saw Theron cross the den in 3 massive strides, saw the girl on the floor scramble backwards, saw his eyes gone completely black with hunger. She threw herself between them. Stop! The word came out with every ounce of command she possessed. It rang off the den walls and filled the space like a physical presence. Theron pulled up short, not stopping but checking his momentum, carrying him close enough that Cassia could feel the heat of his breath, his eyes black and burning locked onto hers. Behind her, the girl screamed. My name is Cassia, she said without turning around. Move to the left wall, slowly. Don't run. She heard scrambling, heard fabric tearing against stone, heard terrified breathing moving away. Then she turned all her attention to Theron. He was shaking, not moving, standing absolutely still, but the stillness itself vibrated with the war happening inside him. Every muscle locked in battle between the hunger and something it could not quite override. His eyes found her face and held it, and they were desperate in a way that reached through all the noise of the hunger. I know, she said quietly. She stepped toward him. I know how bad it is. I know every cell in your body is screaming at you to finish this. She reached up and placed her palm against his jaw. The fur was hot beneath her hand fever, hot burning with the curse. But I also know who you are underneath all of that. I know you can hear me even now. I know you're still in there, Theron, fighting this with everything you have left. She held his gaze, those black eyes that had been silver gray this morning. She is under my protection, Cassia said. Each word was deliberate, clear. And you are stronger than what they made you. You've held the hunger before. You're going to hold it now. She pressed her palm more firmly against his jaw. Stay with me, Theron, right here, right now, stay with me. The sound that came out of him then moved through the den and pressed against the walls. It was agony and effort and the most human sound she had ever heard from an inhuman throat. It was the sound of a man who had been carrying this alone for 4 years, finally having someone stand beside him. The shaking slowed. The hunger did not leave. She could see it in the tension around his eyes and the locked line of his jaw. But it became something he was holding rather than something holding him. He breathed slow and ragged and controlled. His eyes stayed on her face, and gradually the black began to recede, silver gray fighting its way back to the surface. Against the far wall, the girl made a sound that was mostly disbelief. Cassia kept her hand where it was until the worst had passed, until Theron's breathing steadied, until his eyes were more silver than black. Then, and only then, did she turn to look at the girl. She was young, maybe 21, with auburn hair that had come loose from its wedding style at Boehm. She wore a torn wedding gown, cream silk, now ruined by stone dust and in terror. Her eyes, wide and dark, stared at Cassia like she was seeing something impossible. "What are you?" the girl whispered. "Someone who knows what you're going through," Cassia said. She moved slowly, keeping her body between Theron and the girl. "My name is Cassia Winter. 3 weeks ago, a man I thought loved me pushed me into this den on our wedding night. I'm guessing your story isn't all that different." The girl's face did something complicated. "Darian," she said, the name came out like a curse. "He said a seer named me his fated mate. My mother wept from happiness. My father told the whole village." Her voice cracked. "My younger sister kept saying, 'You're going to be a Queen Aisling.'" Cassia's chest tightened. The same lie, the same trap. "She still thinks I'm in the castle right now," Aisling continued, eating from silver plates. "When we get out of here," Cassia said, and she meant every word, "your sister will know exactly what you survived. And the man who put that look on your mother's face will answer for it." Aisling searched her face looking for lies. Found none. "When we get out," she repeated. "You have a plan." "We do," Cassia said. She glanced back at Theron. He had moved to the far corner, the effort of holding the hunger clearly exhausting him. "And he's part of it." Aisling's eyes went wide. "The beast you're working with—" "His name is Theron," Cassia interrupted gently, "and he's not a beast. He's the rightful king of this kingdom, cursed by the same woman who planted the prophecies that brought us both here. Everything Darian told you was a lie, but I'm going to tell you the truth." She stood and offered her hand to Aisling. "Trust me." Aisling looked at the offered hand, looked at Theron in the corner, pale eyes watching, but not approaching, looked at Cassia, who had stood between her and certain death, and won. She took the hand. The rest of that night, Cassia explained everything. The curse, the feeding cycle, the 2 previous wives whose names were carved into the northern wall, the prophecy manipulation, Morgantha's system. Aisling listened without interrupting. When it was done, a silence settled. "He came to my village 3 months ago," Aisling said finally. "The seer had died 2 weeks before. My parents were still grieving her when Darian arrived. It felt like a blessing." She looked at the wall where Adriana and Elena's names were carved. "My younger sister kept asking me to describe the castle. She was so proud." Her jaw tightened. "She's 13, and she's going to spend the rest of her life thinking I abandoned our family." "No," Cassia said firmly. "She's not, because you're going to go back to that village and tell her exactly what happened, and she's going to know you survived." Aisling held her gaze. "You really believe we can get out?" "I know we can," Cassia said. She gestured to the western wall, to the crack that ran floor to ceiling, to the opening they had widened. "We've already started. We just need to finish it." Morning came slowly. Theron had not moved from his corner all night, but when full light spilled through the ceiling crack, when the curse's grip finally loosened, he raised his head and looked across the den. His eyes found Aisling first, held her gaze for a long moment. Then they shifted to Cassia. She saw the question in them, the disbelief, the fragile thing that might have been hope. "You held it," she said simply. "I knew you would." He looked at Aisling again. This time his head lowered slightly, the gesture unmistakable. "An apology." Aisling stared at him, then slowly she lowered her head in return. Day 21 became day 22, and the 3 of them fell into a new rhythm. Cassia explained the wall project to Aisling, showed her where to check for progress. Theron worked with the same focus he had shown before, but there was something different now. Something resolved in the set of his shoulders. He had held the hunger. He had proven to himself that he could. It was late on day 22 when Aisling said the thing that changed everything. They were resting when Aisling spoke into the silence. "I heard something," she said, "before he pushed me. Darian and Morgantha were arguing outside my chambers. They didn't know I was listening." Cassia's head came up. "What did you hear?" Morgantha was angry. She said, "Darian is my son, not that fool king's. His blood is mine alone, which is why the ritual requires—" Aisling paused. She was cut off, but the way she said it My son, not that fool king's. The words hung in the air. Cassia felt her mind race through the implications. Darian isn't legitimate, she breathed. He's not royal blood at all. He's Morgantha's bastard son. The pieces clicked into place with sudden clarity. That was why Morgantha had needed the curse. That was why Theron had to be removed but not killed. Because a true heir, even cursed, still carried more legitimacy than a bastard on a stolen throne. And that was why the feeding required royal blood. Because Darian's blood was not royal enough to sustain the curse. He needed to marry women with genuine connections, needed to mark them with bonds that would tie their bloodlines to his, needed to feed them to Theron to power the curse. Cassia looked across the den at Theron. His silver-gray eyes were burning with something she had not seen before. Not rage, though rage was there, not grief, though grief was there too. Understanding, complete and terrible understanding. She stole everything from you, Cassia said quietly. Your father, your throne, your humanity, 4 years of your life. She stole all of it to put her bastard son in your place. Theron did not move, did not make a sound, but something in his eyes said yes, and beneath that understanding, something else was growing, something that looked like resolve. Then let's take it back, Aisling said. She stood up, brushing stone dust from her ruined gown. Let's finish breaking through that wall. Let's get out of this den, and let's take back everything she stole. She looked at Theron, including your throne. Days 23, 24, and 25 became a coordinated effort. The three of them worked in shifts. Theron striking while Cassia and Aisling directed checking progress, finding weak points. The crack widened. The opening grew. On the evening of day 25, with all three of them exhausted and covered in dust, Theron reared back and struck the wall with everything he had left. A section of stone the size of a door crashed inward. Not cracking, not fracturing, but falling away to reveal darkness beyond. A passage. Narrow but navigable. For a moment, none of them moved. They just stared at the opening, at the cold air rushing through, at freedom made real. Then Cassia started laughing. The sound was tired and relieved and real. Aisling joined her, and the two of them stood there and laughed until tears ran down their faces. Theron watched them with silver-gray eyes that held something Cassia had not seen in all their time together. Joy. We did it, Cassia said when she could breathe again. She looked at Theron at Aisling at the opening in the wall. We actually did it. She crossed to Theron and placed her hand against his jaw one more time. Down here in this den that had held him for 4 years. Among the inscriptions on the walls and the cold in the dark that had been his entire world. She felt him press back against her hand. Just slightly. Just enough. Let's go get your throne, she said. The passage wound upward like a serpent's spine, narrow and steep. Cassia led with one hand on the wall and the other stretched behind her toward Aisling. Theron brought up the rear, his massive form somehow silent despite the confined space. The air changed as they climbed, lost the iron smell of the den, gained the smoke and tallow and living warmth of a working castle. Cassia felt it in her lungs, in the way her wolf senses stretched and caught hold of things they had not tasted in 25 days. They were close. The passage narrowed further, forcing Theron to drop low and crawl. Then it opened into something wider, a corridor lined with barrels and hanging herbs. Storage. Old storage, but connected to the living castle by a door at the far end. Cassia pressed her ear against that door and listened. Footsteps in the distance, voices muffled by stone and wood. The evening rhythms of a castle winding down from the dinner hour. The memory brought rage clean and cold. She welcomed it. Stay close, she whispered to Aisling. Whatever happens, don't stop moving. Stay behind him. She glanced at Theron, and don't look at anyone who runs. They're running because they're smart. One blink. Yes, she opened the door. They moved fast and quiet. The first corridor was empty. The second held 2 guards who turned at the sound of footsteps and saw 2 women in torn wedding gowns. Their face registered confusion first, then recognition as they placed Cassia's face. Then they saw what was behind her. The confusion became something else entirely. Both guards dropped their spears and ran. The third corridor opened into the upper gallery above the great hall, and it was here that the castle found them. A servant rounding the corner froze. She was young, carrying linens that tumbled from her arms. Her eyes went from Cassia to Aisling to Theron, filling the corridor behind them. The scream that came out of her was pure alarm, carrying through stone and wood like a bell. Below in the great hall, the response was immediate, voices rising, chairs scraping, the organized case of a guarded space going to alert. Cassia looked at Theron. He looked back at her, and she saw it there. The resolve thing. The thing she had talked him into believing he deserved. It was fully lit now, and it was not going to be talked back down. She stepped aside. Theron walked to the gallery railing and looked down into the great hall below. What happened next was something people would describe for the rest of their lives. The night the Devourer came up from the dark with two women walking beside it. He did not jump. That was what they would remember. He took the stairs, the slow, deliberate descent. Each step groaning under his weight, each footfall measured and purposeful. He moved like something that had every right to be there, like a king returning to a hall that belonged to him. The great hall below cleared in a wave. Nobles and servants scrambled for walls and doorways. Cassia watched from the gallery as people she had dined with pressed themselves against tapestries and stared. Guards raised weapons, spears and swords catching torchlight. Three of them came in from the seas. Theron swept two aside with a movement that was almost gentle. They went sliding across the hall, floor armor scraping, but unharmed. The third stood his ground. He was older, gray in his beard, with scars that said he had survived things that should have killed him. His spear was leveled at Theron's chest, but his eyes were taking in everything. The beast, the two women, the way Cassia walked beside the creature. "He won't hurt you if you stand down," Cassia said. Her voice carried across the hall. "This is not an attack. This is a reckoning." Something in her voice made the gray-bearded guard lower his spear. 1 inch, then 2, then fully. The other guards followed. By the time Cassia and Aisling descended to the hall floor, the room was theirs. Darian was in the throne room. Of course he was. The throne room doors were massive oak reinforced with iron carved with the crowned wolf crest. Cassia pushed them open herself. Darian was standing on the dais, and beside him stood Morgantha Shade. Small and composed and dressed in gray, with stillness that came from absolute confidence. That confidence did not survive the moment Theron came through the door. Darian moved first, backward. 2 involuntary steps, his heel catching the dais edge. His face did the thing faces do when the story they've been telling themselves meets something that won't fit. "This is impossible," Morgantha said. Her voice was composed, but Cassia heard the calculation underneath. "You should be dead." "I know," Cassia said. She walked forward until she stood in the center of the throne room floor. Theron came to stand beside her, and she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder. "You built a very good trap. You just didn't build it for someone who was paying attention." Morgantha's eyes moved to Theron. Something flickered in them. Not guilt. What moved through her face was closer to annoyance. "The curse required feeding," she said. Each word was precise. "The alternative was letting it destroy the royal bloodline entirely." "I was protecting, you were protecting your son's crown," Cassia interrupted. The words came out flat and clear. "Not the kingdom, not the bloodline. You cursed a man who trusted you. You fed women to him. Women with families, 'cause it was convenient." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And you told yourself it was necessary so you wouldn't have to use the word that fits. Murder." The throne room was very quiet. Morgantha looked at her with calculating eyes and said nothing. Cassia turned to Theron. He was looking at his stepmother with 4 years of the den in his face. The hunger and the guilt and the names on the wall and all of it. He was looking at the architect of everything. His jaw was locked and his silver gray eyes were burning, but he did not move toward her, because that was not who he was. Cassia reached up and placed her hand against his jaw. He did not look away from Morgantha, but she felt him breathe. "You are not a monster," she said quietly, only for him. "You never were, and it is finished now." She pressed her palm flat against the royal crest on his spine. That silver-white brand, Morgantha's mark, the seal of the curse. She felt it beneath her hand like a coal still holding heat, and she felt the mating bond on her neck pulse in answer. The royal blood Darian had given her to feed the beast repurposed, now turned back on the magic that had made him. She had not planned this, had not fully understood it until this moment. But some things did not require understanding. The warmth built between her palm and the brand, not heat like fever, heat like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Theron went rigid. A full-body shudder moved through him, violent and prolonged, and she kept her hand exactly where it was. The shudder deepened. The black fur beneath her palm shifted. The enormous body beside her seemed to compress and expand at once. Aisling made a sound she would later be unable to describe. Darian stumbled off the dais entirely. Morgantha stood very still and watched her work come undone. The transformation took longer than it should have. 4 years of the curse had layered itself deep, but it finished the way all necessary things finish, with quiet inevitability. The black fur receded. The massive frame contracted. The claws retracted. Bone and sinew remembered their original design and returned to it. The moment the last of it resolved, Cassia's hand was no longer against coarse fur. It was against warm skin and the ridge of a scar where the brand had been. She looked up. He was tall, taller than Darian, broad across the shoulders. His hair was dark, falling past his shoulders, tangled from 4 years without scissors. His jaw was sharp, covered in beard growth. His skin was pale from 4 years without sun. And his eyes, silver gray, pale and burning and ancient, were the same eyes she had been reading for 25 days. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and neither of them spoke because the recognition between them was already complete. Had been complete since the night she came down from a ledge and said, "I see you." "Theron," she said, just his name, testing it in the open air. His hand came up and covered hers where it still rested against his chest. His palm was warm and calloused and trembling slightly. "Cassia." His voice was hoarse from 4 years of disuse, rough and raw, and it was the most beautiful sound in the throne room. Behind them, guards filled the doorway, not threatening, waiting. They had served this castle their whole careers. They had served under the old king. They recognized him now. One by one, without being asked, they lowered their weapons. Darian made a different calculation. He looked at his mother being watched by guards whose loyalty had just shifted. Looked at Theron, alive and standing in the throne room wearing nothing but 4 years of suffering and the birthright that had never stopped being his. Looked at the complete absence of anyone who was going to help him. He sat down on the dais steps and put his face in his hands. The sound that came out was not grief, it was relief. The terrible relief of a man who had been carrying a weight he never asked for. Cassia looked at him for a long moment, thought about the wildflowers and the small dinners. She felt nothing for him now. The anger had been spent usefully. She turned back to Theron. He was still looking at her, had not stopped looking at her. "Your throne," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to it. "Our throne," he said. Before anyone could respond, Morgantha moved. Not toward the door. She moved to the side of the dais where tapestries hung. Her hand pressed against the stone behind one, and something clicked. A hidden door. She was through it before anyone could stop her. "There are passages," Aisling said urgently. "Service passages from when the castle was a fortress. She knows every one." Theron's jaw tightened. He moved toward the hidden door but stopped at the threshold. The passage was narrow, built for someone small. "Go," Cassia said. "I'll follow." The passage twisted and turned. Cassia's wolf senses caught Morgantha's scent, tracked it through the dark. Behind her, Theron's breathing, Aisling's lighter footsteps. They were in the old wing now, the part where Darian had claimed there was a secret garden. Morgantha's scent led to a door. Theron did not hesitate. He put his shoulder against it, and the old woods shattered. The room beyond made Cassia's breath stop. It was a ritual chamber. The ritual chamber. The walls were covered in symbols. Not carved, but painted layer upon layer of arcane script. The floor was marked with binding circles, and in the center, surrounded by circles, stood an altar. On that altar sat a book, old, leather-bound, open to a page covered in symbols. Morgantha stood on the far side, one hand resting on the book's pages. "You should not have come here," she said. Her composure was back. "This room is warded against violence. You cannot touch me." Theron took a step forward and hit something invisible. The air shimmered where his hand pressed like heat rising from stone. He pushed harder. The shimmer intensified but did not break. 4 years, he said. His voice was still rough, but the words were clear. 4 years you kept me in that hell. For what? So your bastard son could sit on my father's throne. For his future, Morgantha said. For the life he deserved. You had everything by birthright. He had to fight for every scrap. I gave him what the gods would not. You gave him a throne built on corpses, Cassia said. Adriana, Elena, how many women did you feed to a curse you built? As many as were necessary. The words hung in the air. Aisling stepped forward. Then it's my turn. Both Morgantha and Cassia turned. What? Morgantha said. I'm the third bride, Aisling said. You brought me here to be fed to the curse. You planted a prophecy in my village when I was a child. She took another step. But here's what you didn't plan for. I'm not just some merchant's daughter. I'm the daughter you lost. The words landed like a physical blow. Morgantha's composure cracked. Just for a moment. That's impossible, Morgantha breathed. She died. The ritual required A sacrifice. Aisling finished. Your own blood to seal the curse. But the ritual didn't take all of me. It took my memory, my first 5 years, but I survived. And when you realized I survived, you couldn't risk anyone making the connection. So you had me taken away. You made me disappear. She stopped at the edge of the binding circle. And then you chose me, your own daughter, because I had just enough of your bloodline, because you could not imagine I would survive long enough to remember. The silence was absolute. But I did remember, Aisling said quietly. When I fell into that den, something in me recognized the name. And when I overheard you arguing, I knew. She placed her hand against the barrier. The air shimmered beneath her palm, but did not stop her. Because she was Morgantha's daughter. Because the ward recognized her blood. Her hand passed through. Morgantha's eyes went wide. No, the wards should... The wards recognize bloodline, Cassia said. Your wards, your blood magic. Aisling is your daughter. The wards think she belongs here. Aisling stepped through the barrier fully, stood inside the binding circle with her mother. You took my childhood, she said. You took my family. You tried to take my life. She reached for the book on the altar. No, Morgantha lunged, but Aisling was faster. Her fingers closed on the leather binding, and she pulled it off the altar. The moment the book left the altar, something changed. The symbols on the walls began to glow with darkness that seemed to bleed into the room. The binding circles cracked. The wards shattered. And Morgantha, who had been sustained for years by the magic in this room, began to age. Fast. Too fast. Skin tightening, then sagging. Hair fading from gray to white to falling out. Bones showing through flesh. She collapsed to her knees, looked up at Aisling with eyes that were clouding. I did it all for you, she whispered. Both of you. You gave us nothing, Aisling said. You took. That's all you ever did. Morgantha tried to speak again, but the words were lost as the last of her magic-sustained life ran out. She crumpled to the floor and did not move. The silence that followed was heavy. Aisling stood over her mother's body for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out of the binding circle to where Cassia and Theron waited. It's done, she said simply. Theron looked at the body, at the ritual chamber that had been the site of his own destruction, at the symbols already fading. It's done, he agreed. They walked out together. The throne room had filled in their absence. Nobles and servants and guards, all waiting. The council was assembled at the base of the dais, old men and women who had served under Theron's father. The senior counselor, a gray-haired wolf named Aldrich, rose when Theron entered. His eyes went to Theron's face, to the silver-gray eyes that every person in the kingdom had known belonged to the Ashvale line. He bowed, deep and formal. One by one, the rest followed. Alpha King Theron Ashvale, Aldrich said. His voice carried across the throne room. Rightful heir to the kingdom of Ethoria, we believed you lost. We grieved your death. And now we thank the gods that our grief was unfounded. He straightened. The throne is yours. It has always been yours. We await your justice. Theron stood before them in torn clothing, barefoot, wearing 4 years of suffering. But he stood straight, stood certain, stood like a king who had never stopped being one. Morgantha Shade is dead, he said. His voice was still rough but strong. She died in the ritual chamber where she cursed me 4 years ago. The magic that sustained her ran out when the ritual was broken. That is her justice. He turned to Darian, still sitting on the dais steps. Darian Ashvale, you wore a crown you had no right to. You married women under false pretenses and fed them to a curse. You knew what was being done and did nothing. Darian looked up. His face was blotchy, broken. I know, he said. I know what I did. I know what I am. Then you will spend the rest of your life knowing it in the slave mines, Theron said. Each word was deliberate, clear, just justice. You will work them as the women you fed to me never had the chance to. You will earn your bread with your hands every day. And every day you will remember exactly what bought you that life. Guards moved forward. Darian did not resist as they bound his hands. He looked at Theron once as they led him past, and what was in his eyes was not anger. It was relief. Terrible, exhausted relief. When the doors closed, Aldrich turned back to Theron. What are your orders, my king? Theron was quiet for a moment. Then he turned, and his silver-gray eyes found Cassia. First, he said, we will honor the women who died in the den. Adriana of House Voss and Elena of House Crane will be remembered not as victims of fever and childbirth, but as queens murdered by conspiracy. Their names will be read into the record. Their families will be compensated. Their bodies will be recovered and buried with honors. He crossed to where Cassia stood. Second, we will reform the laws that allowed this. No more forced bonds, no more prophecies used to manipulate families, no more silence about what happens behind closed doors. He stopped in front of her. And third, I will take my mate, my true mate, the woman who fell into hell and decided to drag me out of it, the woman who saw a monster and said, I see a king, the woman who stood between me and the hunger and won. He reached up and cupped her face in both hands. Cassia of House Winter. I knew from the first night what you were to me. When you came down from that ledge, when anyone else would have stayed hidden. When you spoke to me like I was still human even when I had forgotten how to be. I knew, but I did not believe I had the right to it. You didn't get to decide that alone, Cassia said. The same words, the same truth. A smile crossed his face then, full and real and new. The first one in 4 years. He kissed her. The council erupted. Not in shock, in approval. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for 4 years. Cassia kissed him back and felt the mating bond on her neck, Darian's mark, dissolve like frost in sunlight, replaced by something warmer and older and entirely right. The bond that had always been underneath. The one the prophecy had been pointing toward all along. She pulled back and looked at him. Our throne, she said. His hand was still against her face. His silver gray eyes were very bright. Our throne, he agreed. The coronation happened 3 days later. Time enough to recover bodies from the den. Time enough to send riders to families who needed to know their daughters had not simply disappeared. Time enough to let truth spread through the kingdom like water through stone. Cassia stood beside Theron in the same throne room where she had married Darian. But everything was different. The crown on Theron's head was his father's crown, cleaned and returned to its rightful place. The crown Aldrich placed on her head was simple silver. Real, not performance. When Aldrich spoke the words of binding, when he declared them king and queen, before the assembled nobles and common people, the sound that rose was genuine joy. They knew the story, knew about the curse in the den and the 25 days, knew about Cassia standing between Theron and the hunger, knew about the prophecies in Morgantha's fall. They knew they had been lied to, and they knew the lies had ended. 6 months later, Cassia stood on the balcony outside the royal chambers and looked out over the kingdom. Spring had come to Athoria. Below in the garden that had been planted over the sealed den flowers were beginning to bloom. Theron came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. What are you thinking about? Prophecies, she said. She leaned back against him. My father had that prophecy framed on the wall for 17 years. Your daughter shall be mated to a king, and her blood shall change the course of a kingdom. It was right, Theron said, just not the way anyone expected. Cassia watched the garden below. Aisling was walking with her sister, the 13-year-old, who had learned the truth and loved her even more for surviving it. The prophecy was right, Cassia said. My blood did change the kingdom, not through being fed to a curse, through survival, through choosing to see humanity in a beast, through refusing to accept that any of it was necessary. Theron kissed her forehead. From the garden below, Aisling's laughter rose bright and clear and free. Beside her, her sister laughed too, and the sound carried on the spring wind. Cassia and Theron stood on the balcony and watched their kingdom wake from a long winter. Watched the memorial garden bloom. Watched Aisling teach her sister about strength and survival. And somewhere in the capital city, in a small house in the merchant quarter, Tobias Winter took down a framed prophecy from his wall, looked at it for a long moment, then put it in a drawer where it could not dictate anyone's future. Destinies were not written in stars or prophecies or curses. They were written by the choices people made when everything was taken from them and they had to decide who they were going to be. Cassia had been thrown into darkness and told to die. She had chosen to live instead, and in that choice she had changed more than the course of a kingdom. She had changed the story itself.